In this jaw-dropping story of betrayal and hidden motives, a husband's life spirals when he uncovers his wife's dark secrets. What begins as a shocking revelation about her affair turns into a deeper, deadly conspiracy. As he faces the fallout, he learns the chilling truth that will change everything. Will he escape unscathed? Listen to find out in this unforgettable tale of love, deceit, and revenge. Welcome to RedHead Cheating, your premier YouTube channel dedicated to unveiling jaw-dropping and unbelievable tales of infidelity. We are your go-to source for the most shocking and scandalous cheating stories that will leave you both horrified and intrigued. Join us as we delve into the secrets, lies, and betrayals that have rocked relationships and shattered trust. Our channel is committed to sharing these cautionary and eye-opening narratives, not to glorify cheating, but to shed light on the devastating consequences it can have on individuals and families. Cheating is a painful way to end a relationship and often leaves the other partner in a dark place. By presenting these stories, we hope to alleviate the pain you're experiencing by helping you realize that you're not alone. We are a media company focused on delivering the highest quality stories. Sometimes based on true events, our narratives always conclude with a valuable lesson, adding educational value to each video. Brian Campbell and his wife Antonia were enjoying a quiet Saturday morning, each absorbed in the news on their tablets, when the doorbell rang. Antonia visibly jumped, looking more startled than usual. Brian had noticed her jumpiness over the past week, though he'd chalked it up to stress. Oddly, the tension seemed to have rekindled some closeness between them, a sharp contrast to the bland, disconnected interactions they'd shared in recent months. Setting down his tablet, Brian stood up. "I'll get it," he said, making his way to the door. Opening it, he found himself face to face with two men flashing badges that identified them as police officers. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Brian asked, maintaining a calm tone despite the surprise. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a steely expression, spoke first. "Are you Mr. Brian Campbell?" Brian nodded, confirming his identity. "Yes, that's me." The officer extended a thick stack of paperwork. "We're Officers Stevens and Peters from the Austin Police Department. We're here with a search warrant." The words hit Brian like a wave. "A search warrant?" he echoed, his mind scrambling for answers. "What's this about?" "Everything's detailed in the document," the officer replied, gesturing for Brian to review the papers. "You're welcome to contact a lawyer if you'd like. We'd also like to speak with your wife, Antonia Campbell, if she's available." Brian's gaze shifted toward the kitchen. "She's in there," he said, guiding them down the hall. As he followed the officers, he skimmed the warrant, catching specific phrases that made his stomach twist: firearms, possessions of Mr. Gerald O'Brien, murder investigation. Leading them into the kitchen, Brian asked, "Does this have anything to do with that wealthy guy who was found dead last week?" "My wife works for one of his companies, but neither of us knew him personally." The words felt surreal as he spoke them, as if he were an actor in a crime drama. He turned to look at Antonia, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with shock. Her expression looked almost guilty, and for the first time, Brian felt a chill of suspicion. "Antonia," he said, his voice edged with confusion, "do you have any idea what this is about?" "They're here to search our house. The warrant says it's related to Gerald O'Brien's murder." Before Antonia could respond, one of the officers interrupted. "Sir, please allow us to handle the questioning. We'll need to speak with Mrs. Campbell alone. Could you wait outside the kitchen?" Brian's patience began to fray. "Is she under arrest?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "I think she should have a lawyer here before she says anything." Antonia nodded slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, please," she murmured, tears beginning to well in her eyes. The officer gave a nod. "That's her right. We can arrange a formal interview next week. For now, we're just collecting evidence, and no one is under arrest." He added, "We'll also need to speak with you, Mr. Campbell." We can conduct the interview at the station at the same time as your wife's, and of course, you're entitled to legal representation. Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Fine, he said. I'll talk, but I'm staying here. He shot a look at Antonia, the look of a man grappling with disbelief and a gnawing sense of betrayal. Then came the next question, one that seemed almost accusatory. Do you have any firearms in the house, Mr. Campbell? Brian straightened. Yes, I own a few pistols. They're all locked up in my gun safe, except for one in my bedside drawer. Officer Peters stepped forward. Would you mind if I accompany you to retrieve that firearm, and then inspect the rest in your safe? Realizing he had little choice, Brian nodded. Sure. Follow me, he said, leading the officer upstairs to the bedroom. He pointed to the top drawer of his bedside table. It's in there. Peters put on gloves, removed the pistol, and secured it in an evidence bag. Thank you, sir. Now, the safe. Brian led him to his office, unlocking the heavy safe door and stepping back. Take what you need, he said, feeling a mix of frustration and powerlessness. In the following hours, the officers combed through every inch of the house, cataloging his firearms and conducting a thorough search that left the home in disarray. Brian couldn't shake the tension in his gut, the suspicion that there was more to Antonia's connection to O'Brien than she had ever let on. When the search finally ended, the officers handed Brian a receipt for the firearms they'd taken and thanked him for his cooperation. Before leaving, Officer Peters pulled Antonia aside, advising her to contact them for a formal interview at the station. After they left, Brian rounded on Antonia, his patience gone. Antonia, what is going on? He demanded, his voice laced with hurt and confusion. You work for one of O'Brien's companies, but I never thought you had any connection to him. Were you involved with him? Antonia's face crumpled, tears spilling over as she whispered, I'm so sorry, before fleeing to their bedroom and locking the door behind her. In that moment, Brian felt his world shift, realizing that the woman he thought he knew might be hiding secrets that would unravel everything. After the police left, Brian sat in the quiet of their living room, processing the whirlwind of events that had just turned his morning upside down. His mind spun with questions, doubts, and a creeping sense of dread. Antonia had retreated to their bedroom, shutting him out with a finality that made his stomach twist. He'd always trusted her, but her reaction to the police's arrival had revealed something unsettling. He walked to the door of their bedroom and knocked softly. Antonia? Can we talk? There was a long silence before she replied, her voice muffled and shaky. Not right now, Brian. I just need some time. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't recognize this woman, this closed-off, secretive person hiding behind a locked door. Antonia had always been open with him, or so he'd thought. Now, the nagging question was, how much did I really know about her? Unable to shake his suspicions, he went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, trying to steady his nerves. He began replaying everything he knew about Gerald O'Brien, the wealthy businessman whose murder was now inextricably linked to their lives. O'Brien was a prominent figure in town, known for his vast real estate holdings and corporate influence. He was someone Brian had only seen in passing at local events. The idea that his wife could be connected to this man, much less involved in something as serious as his murder, seemed surreal. As the minutes dragged on, Antonia finally emerged from the bedroom, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. She avoided his gaze as she walked to the kitchen, her movements tense and awkward. Are you going to tell me what's going on? Brian asked, his voice low but firm. Antonia hesitated, gripping the counter. It's complicated, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know it would get this far. Brian felt his pulse quicken. Get this far? Antonia, the police were here with a warrant. They're investigating a murder, and they took my guns as evidence. I think I deserve to know what's happening. She looked down, wringing her hands, as though searching for the right words. "Brian, I don't know what to tell you. Gerald was someone I knew. I worked with him on some projects, but it wasn't anything serious. I never thought it would come to this." "Someone you knew?" Brian repeated, narrowing his eyes. "Is that all? Just a work connection?" Antonia swallowed, her silence telling him more than he wanted to know. The walls she'd put up were strong, and it was clear she wasn't about to let him in, not yet. Every ounce of trust he had in her felt like it was being chipped away with each evasive look, each vague half-truth she offered. "Look," he said finally, trying to keep his composure, "if there's something you're not telling me, I need to know now. This isn't just going to go away." She sighed, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Brian, please, just trust me. I'm not involved in anything criminal. I can't explain it all right now. It's too complicated." Brian stared at her, a bitter taste forming in his mouth. Trust? That word felt empty now, hollow. "Antonia, the police don't just show up at people's homes over complicated issues. They have a search warrant for evidence related to a murder, and your name is somehow linked to it." Antonia's hands clenched, and he noticed the faintest tremble in her fingers. "I need time to figure this out, Brian. I don't want to involve you in something that could make things worse." Brian took a deep breath, suppressing the anger building inside him. "Maybe it's too late for that. They already took my guns, and they already know you live here." She met his gaze for a fleeting moment, her eyes filled with guilt, before looking away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." Brian watched her walk back to the bedroom, her figure disappearing down the hallway, and felt a profound sense of isolation settle over him. This was his wife, the woman he'd built a life with, yet she felt like a stranger, wrapped in secrets he hadn't been allowed to see. His mind turned back to the police, the cold, direct language of the search warrant, the names and charges listed there. He knew that trust wouldn't be enough to get through this. Whatever Antonia was hiding, Brian was determined to find out, whether she liked it or not. The following morning, Brian woke to an empty bed. Antonia had left a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "Went for a walk. Need to clear my head." He stared at her words, feeling his frustration grow. The distance between them had never felt so vast, and her refusal to be honest about her connection to Gerald O'Brien was pushing him to the edge. He needed answers, but he also knew that whatever was happening, he couldn't afford to navigate it alone. Determined to take action, Brian dialed the number of a local criminal defense attorney he'd researched the night before, Ted Walker. Ted came highly recommended and was known for his success with complex cases involving high-profile clients. If anyone could help sort out this mess, it was him. Within an hour, Brian was sitting across from Ted in his office, a space filled with rows of books and framed certificates that gave off an aura of quiet confidence. Ted was in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor that put Brian at ease. "So, Brian," Ted began, leaning forward, "I understand that the police executed a search warrant at your house yesterday." Brian nodded, recounting the details, the officers, the search warrant, the confiscation of his firearms, and Antonia's behavior. "The warrant mentioned Gerald O'Brien's murder. I didn't know him personally, but my wife, Antonia, worked for one of his companies. Since they questioned her and took my guns, I'm guessing they think she's somehow connected to what happened." Ted listened carefully, nodding at intervals. "That sounds serious, Brian. They don't hand out search warrants without probable cause, especially in a homicide case. The fact that your wife is linked to O'Brien through her work is one thing, but the police must have more reason to think she's involved." Brian shifted uncomfortably. "She won't tell me anything. I've tried asking, but she just says it's complicated and that I should trust her." Ted's gaze sharpened. "Brian, in situations like these, trust only goes so far. The police suspect she knows more than she's letting on, and given the nature of the case, it's critical that you protect yourself, too. If she's unwilling to speak openly with you, we may need to approach this from a different angle. Brian nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. What do you suggest? Ted opened a file and started taking notes. First, I'd advise that you not speak with the police until we're certain of what they're looking for. You have the right to remain silent, and I'd suggest exercising that right until we know more. Secondly, I'll reach out to the DA's office and get a sense of where they're going with this investigation. If they view Antonia as a person of interest, we'll need to approach this cautiously. Brian felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Do you think they'll come after me, too? Ted gave him a reassuring look. Unlikely, unless there's evidence connecting you directly to O'Brien. Right now, their focus seems to be on Antonia, which complicates things for you as her spouse, but doesn't make you guilty by association. However, I'd recommend keeping a low profile and not discussing this with anyone else. The attorney leaned back, his expression thoughtful. If Antonia is linked to O'Brien in ways beyond a simple work relationship, the police may try to build a case around that connection. My job is to ensure they don't entangle you in whatever they find. I'll also need to speak with Antonia directly, as her counsel. Is she willing to work with a lawyer? Brian hesitated, thinking of Antonia's reluctance to explain herself. I'll convince her, he said finally. But I need you to understand that I'm in the dark here. She's keeping something from me, and I don't know how much of it might involve me. Ted nodded, his face a picture of professional calm. Understood. I'll approach her with the goal of protecting both her and your interests. If she's genuinely innocent, we can set the record straight. But if she's hiding anything, we'll need to make sure that comes out on our terms, not theirs. Just as they wrapped up, Brian's phone buzzed with a text from Antonia, "We need to talk when you get home." He felt a strange twist in his gut as he read her words, unsure of whether it was anticipation or dread. "I have to go," he told Ted. "She wants to talk." Ted nodded, handing him a card. "Tell her about me. Encourage her to open up, at least to her legal counsel. And remember, say nothing to the police until we've consulted. I'll be here if you need anything." With the attorney's advice fresh in his mind, Brian left the office, his thoughts racing. Antonia had secrets, and whatever they were, they had drawn them both into something he never anticipated. The only certainty he had now was his need to know the truth, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to uncover it. Brian had barely stepped into the house when he heard voices coming from the living room. The first was Antonia's, her tone strained and defensive, while the second belonged to a man whose deep, unyielding voice Brian didn't recognize. As he entered, he found himself face to face with two detectives, their expressions severe, and Antonia, standing rigidly beside the couch, clutching her hands tightly. "Mr. Campbell," one of the detectives greeted him, his tone polite but firm. "We're here to take Mrs. Campbell into custody for further questioning regarding the investigation of Gerald O'Brien's murder." Brian's heart pounded. Into custody? What does that mean? Is she under arrest? "Yes," the detective replied. "She's a person of interest in the case, and we have additional evidence that warrants her formal detainment for questioning." Antonia's face crumpled, and she looked over at Brian, her eyes wide and pleading. "Brian, I didn't do anything. You have to believe me." Brian felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over him. His mind flashed to Ted's advice, "Stay calm. Say nothing to the police without counsel present." He wanted to demand answers, to tell them they had it wrong, but he knew he needed to be careful. "I've retained a lawyer for Antonia," he managed, his voice tense. "His name is Ted Walker. I want him contacted before any questioning begins." One of the detectives nodded. "That's her right, and we'll make sure she has counsel present. We're not here to make assumptions, we're here to gather information." They moved toward Antonia, one officer taking her arm gently but firmly, while the other read her rights. Her eyes filled with tears as she was escorted out, leaving Brian standing alone in the living room, watching as his wife disappeared through the front door with 2 detectives in tow. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Brian's mind raced with questions, guilt, and anger. How had they gotten to this point? Just a few days ago, life had been mundane, predictable. Now, everything was spiraling out of control, and the woman he'd shared his life with for years had just been led away by police. He felt a wave of nausea, his mind replaying the search, the evasions, her secrets, all of it clashing in a storm of emotions. Brian quickly dialed Ted's number, pacing back and forth as he waited for the attorney to pick up. When Ted's steady voice came through the line, Brian immediately filled him in on the situation. "They've taken her, Ted," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed frustration. "They arrested her right in our living room. They're taking her in for questioning." Ted's tone remained calm and professional. "Okay, Brian. Take a deep breath. This is what we prepared for. They'll contact me when she arrives, and I'll ensure that no questioning happens without my presence. I know this is overwhelming, but stay calm." "What should I do?" Brian asked, desperate for direction. "Do I go down to the station? Wait for her here?" "Stay home for now," Ted advised. "I'll be in touch as soon as I have more information. The most important thing is to avoid speaking to anyone about this. If anyone, including reporters, reaches out, tell them you have no comment. The less information out there, the better." Brian nodded, even though Ted couldn't see him, and forced himself to thank the lawyer before ending the call. He dropped onto the couch, his mind swimming with conflicting emotions. Anger simmered beneath the surface, not only at the situation but at Antonia's secrecy. What had she done, or hidden, that led her to this point? The hours that followed were agonizing. He alternated between pacing the house and sitting in silence, his mind a relentless loop of worst-case scenarios. Every ring of his phone sent his heart racing, and each passing minute without news weighed on him. Finally, late that evening, his phone lit up with a message from Ted, "I'm with Antonia. She's holding up, but I'll need to debrief with you in the morning." Reading the message, Brian felt a hollow sense of relief. She was safe for now, at least. But the situation was far from over, and he knew the coming days would test him in ways he hadn't imagined. He tried to sleep that night but couldn't shake the questions gnawing at him. What was Antonia hiding? And how much deeper did her connection to Gerald O'Brien go? The answer, he suspected, would change everything. The following morning, Brian met Ted in his office. He'd hardly slept, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't shake. As he sat across from Ted, the attorney gave him a grim look, the kind that told Brian he wasn't going to like what he was about to hear. "Brian," Ted began, folding his hands on the desk, "I'm going to be direct with you. During our conversation last night, Antonia admitted to something that changes the nature of her case, and probably your relationship." Brian's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Ted took a deep breath. "She confessed to having an affair with Gerald O'Brien. It wasn't just a professional relationship, it was personal. She'd been involved with him for months before his death." The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Gerald O'Brien, the man who had thrown their lives into chaos, the man whose murder investigation had brought police into their home, this was the man his wife had chosen to betray him with. He stared at Ted, trying to process the betrayal. "An affair?" he managed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's been lying to me about everything." Ted nodded, his expression empathetic but professional. "I'm afraid so. She admitted to the affair as part of her initial questioning, but she maintains that she had no involvement in his murder." Brian's hands clenched into fists. He felt anger, pain, humiliation, all of it boiling inside him. "She's been lying to me for months. I thought I could trust her, that there was some explanation. But this." Ted waited a moment, allowing Brian time to process before he continued. "As her attorney, I have to advise her to cooperate fully with the investigation. Her relationship with O'Brien, while damaging to her personal life, might complicate the case. But what matters now is that she's open with us so we can protect her legally. Brian's mind raced. He'd imagined many scenarios, financial troubles, secrets about work, but not this. He'd never considered that Antonia, the woman he'd shared his life with, would betray him like this. Did she say anything else? He asked, forcing himself to stay composed. Anything that might explain why? Ted looked at him carefully. She mentioned that O'Brien made her feel important, that their relationship was exciting and unlike what she felt in her marriage. She said it was never meant to hurt you, that it was something she got carried away with. Ted paused. But Brian, I think she's trying to save herself now. Her focus is on reducing her involvement in this case. Brian scoffed bitterly. Of course. She thinks she can lie to me, betray me, and then just move on without facing consequences. Ted gave a slight nod. I understand your anger, Brian, but I need you to focus on yourself now. Antonia's choices are hers, but your life and reputation are separate. If you want to distance yourself legally, we can start by filing a separation agreement. Brian felt his heart harden. Do it. She's made her bed, and I'm not about to lie in it with her. I'll go through with whatever you suggest. Ted gathered the paperwork, nodding. I'll get started. I'll handle her defense independently, but my priority is ensuring you're protected financially and legally. This is a complicated case, but we can control how it impacts your life. The rest of the meeting felt like a blur, with Ted walking him through the initial steps for filing for separation. As Brian signed the documents, he felt a sense of grim determination. He'd entered that office as a betrayed husband, devastated by the truth he'd uncovered. But he left as a man prepared to rebuild his life, no matter what it took. Antonia had made her choices, and now, he was making his. He was done being the trusting, forgiving husband. If she wanted to tear apart everything they'd built, he'd be the one to finish the job. The days following his separation filing were relentless. News of Antonia's arrest and her affair with Gerald O'Brien had made it into the local media, sparking intense public interest. The high-profile nature of the case, murder, betrayal, and the involvement of a prominent businessman, created a perfect storm of scandal, and Brian found himself squarely in the eye of it. Reporters hounded him outside his home, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions, each one more invasive than the last. Mr. Campbell, did you know about your wife's affair with Gerald O'Brien? Do you believe your wife is innocent? How are you handling the separation after her arrest? Brian forced himself to stay silent, doing his best to ignore the swarm of reporters every time he left the house. Ted had warned him to avoid engaging with the media, advising that even a single word could complicate matters. But the constant attention felt like a punishment for something he hadn't done, and it took every ounce of self-control not to respond, to defend himself against the narrative that was beginning to form. Friends and acquaintances reached out, some expressing sympathy, others fishing for gossip. At work, he felt the subtle shift in how people looked at him, some with pity, others with suspicion, as though he might somehow be implicated in Antonia's mess. His colleagues were polite, but conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room, and he could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing down on him. One afternoon, he met with Ted to discuss the media coverage and how best to navigate it. This will eventually die down, Ted assured him, though his expression remained serious. Right now, they're feeding on the shock value of the story. But we can't risk you getting tangled in the case by speaking publicly. My advice is to maintain a strict, no-comment stance. Brian nodded, though the frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. It's hard to just sit back while they paint me as either complicit or completely blind. I had no idea what she was doing, and now it feels like I'm the one being punished. Ted gave him a sympathetic look. I understand, Brian, but trust me, saying nothing is your best defense. Public opinion will shift when the legal details emerge. For now, you need to focus on keeping your head down and letting me handle the legal and media angles." Despite Ted's reassurances, Brian felt the isolation intensify. He couldn't go anywhere without feeling watched, judged, or scrutinized, and every time he thought he'd reached the peak of frustration, a new headline or comment would push him further. Antonia's actions had placed him in the crossfire of a scandal he wanted no part of, and it seemed like every detail of his life was now public property. One morning, as he was leaving the grocery store, he saw a newspaper with a headline that read, "Husband of murder suspect speaks out, a blatant fabrication," as he hadn't spoken to the media at all. The article was filled with conjectures about his complicity in the affair and suggestions that he'd chosen to look the other way to keep up appearances. Back home, he found himself pacing in frustration. Antonia's betrayal had already cost him his marriage, but now it was costing him his privacy, his reputation, and even his sense of security in his own community. He called Ted, his anger boiling over. "They're making me out to be part of this, Ted. I'm being humiliated for things I had no part in. Is there anything we can do to stop them?" Ted's voice remained calm but firm. "Brian, I understand your anger, but the media will twist things however they want, and trying to fight it right now would only add fuel to the fire. Focus on maintaining a solid reputation and keeping your head up. Once the case concludes, we'll release a statement that clears up the misconceptions. For now, unfortunately, all we can do is wait." Brian took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Ted was right, he had to be patient. But as he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a nightmare he hadn't chosen, one where every piece of his life was open for public consumption, judged by people who had no idea of the betrayal he was dealing with. In the end, he resolved to focus inward, cutting off social media, avoiding the news, and limiting his interactions with anyone who wasn't family or a close friend. It was the only way to protect himself, to preserve the shreds of dignity he had left in the face of a scandal that wasn't his to bear. A few days after the media storm hit its peak, Brian received an unexpected call from Ted. "Brian, we've uncovered something significant," Ted began, his tone cautious. "It's evidence that could shift the direction of Antonia's case. But I need you to prepare yourself, it's complicated." Brian sat up, bracing himself. "What did you find?" "Through the investigation, we located emails and transaction records that suggest Antonia may have been at the scene of O'Brien's murder shortly before he died. However, there's also information pointing to potential involvement by a third party, someone close to O'Brien who had financial ties to him. It's possible she may have been a witness, not a suspect, but her presence there still casts a heavy shadow over her claims of innocence." The revelation hit Brian hard. It meant Antonia's connection to O'Brien wasn't just a brief fling, it had been deeper, more entangled than he'd ever imagined. She'd been at the scene, maybe even witnessed the crime. And yet, she had told him nothing. "That still doesn't explain why she lied to me," Brian replied, his voice laced with frustration. "Why not just tell me the truth?" Ted hesitated. "There's more, Brian. Antonia's demeanor has shifted, she's getting desperate. She wants to see you, to explain herself. She's claiming she was forced to stay silent out of fear, that there were threats made against her by people connected to O'Brien. But whether that's true or just an attempt to elicit sympathy, I can't say for sure." Brian clenched his fist, anger simmering under the surface. He had been trying to move on, trying to rebuild his life. Now, the idea of facing her, of hearing her excuses and justifications, felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. "Do you think she's telling the truth?" Brian asked finally, struggling to keep his emotions in check. Ted was silent for a moment. "Honestly, it's hard to tell. But if she is, we may be able to use that information to shift suspicion away from her. It could suggest she's more of a witness than a direct accomplice. However, this would mean that her safety could be at risk, and that would complicate things." Brian felt a twinge of conflict. Despite everything she'd done, the lies, the affair, the secrecy, a part of him still felt responsible, as though he owed it to her to help. But another part, the part still reeling from her betrayal, wanted nothing more than to close the door on her and leave her to deal with the consequences of her choices. Ted broke the silence. "You don't have to make any decisions right now, Brian. I know this is a lot to take in. But if you're willing, meeting with her could clarify some of the details. It may be our best shot at getting a clearer picture of what really happened." Brian sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll meet her. But I need to hear the full story, no more half-truths or evasions. If she wants my help, she's going to have to give me everything." Ted agreed and promised to arrange the meeting in a secure location. Brian hung up, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. He would face Antonia, hear her story, and finally get the answers he deserved. But he knew that whatever she had to say, it wouldn't change the path he was on. A week later, Ted called Brian with unexpected news. The district attorney's office had offered Antonia a plea deal. If she agreed to testify about her knowledge of Gerald O'Brien's business dealings, particularly about a high-stakes investment scam that implicated several prominent figures, they would reduce her charges from accomplice to manslaughter. This would mean a lesser sentence, allowing her to avoid the harshest penalties. Brian listened carefully as Ted explained the situation. "Brian, this plea deal is Antonia's best shot at reducing her sentence. But it would also mean admitting her involvement, at least as a witness, to illegal activities that led up to O'Brien's murder. She'll be under house arrest for a while, but eventually, she'd serve time in a low-security facility instead of facing a lengthy prison sentence." Brian absorbed the news in silence. Part of him wanted her to take the deal, it was the clearest path to closure. But a larger part of him felt no sympathy, only a cold resolve to move forward without her. Ted cleared his throat. "There's more, Brian. Antonia has requested to see you one last time before she makes her final decision on the deal. She claims she needs closure, especially since you filed for separation." Brian knew what she really wanted. She wanted his forgiveness, or at least his understanding, to alleviate her own guilt. But he was no longer willing to be her emotional crutch, not after everything she'd put him through. Still, he agreed to meet her, if only to say his final piece. The next day, Brian met Antonia at Ted's office, where she waited under the watchful eye of security. She looked drained, her once polished appearance replaced by a worn, vulnerable expression. But Brian felt no pang of sympathy. Instead, he saw a woman desperate to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage she'd created. "Brian," she began, her voice wavering. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I wanted to explain. I wanted you to know that I never meant for it to end like this." Brian looked at her coldly, his voice steady. "Antonia, you lied to me. You betrayed me, humiliated me, and dragged me into a scandal I had no part in. Don't stand there and pretend this was all some accident." She flinched, looking away. I know I hurt you. I was selfish and stupid. Gerald made me feel important, like my life was more than just routine. But I didn't know how dangerous things would get. That's the problem, Antonia. You never thought about anyone but yourself, he replied. You didn't consider what this would do to our family, our life together. You were only focused on your own thrill, your own needs. And now, you're paying for it. Antonia's shoulders slumped, her gaze fixed on the floor. You're right. I ruined everything. I've lost everything that mattered. And now, I just want your forgiveness. Brian shook his head. Forgiveness? Antonia, I'm moving on. I filed for separation because I refuse to be tied to someone who could so easily tear down the life we built. You may take the plea deal, but don't do it for my forgiveness. Do it because it's the only way out of the mess you created. A few moments passed as she absorbed his words. "So, this is really it," she whispered. "There's no chance, no way we could ever fix this." He looked at her, a sense of finality settling over him. "No, Antonia. This is the end. I hope you find what you're looking for, but you won't find it with me." Antonia nodded slowly, a resigned acceptance in her eyes. She glanced at Ted, signaling her decision to accept the plea deal. As she was escorted from the room, Brian felt a profound sense of relief, as though a weight he'd carried for months had finally lifted. Ted turned to him, nodding. "It's over, Brian. You can finally move forward." And with that, Brian knew he was truly free to rebuild his life, unburdened by Antonia's lies and betrayals. It was a new beginning, one he intended to embrace fully. On the morning before her sentencing, Antonia reached out one last time, asking to meet with Brian in a supervised setting. Reluctantly, he agreed, knowing this would be their final conversation. He wasn't looking forward to seeing her, but there was a part of him that wanted closure, a chance to put the last pieces of his life with her firmly behind him. They met in a small, bare room in the courthouse, the air thick with unspoken words. Antonia looked fragile, her once confident demeanor replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she seemed hesitant, as though unsure how to begin. "Brian," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to see you before everything changes." He stayed silent, his expression unreadable, waiting for her to continue. "I know nothing I say can fix what I did. I hurt you in ways I can't even imagine. I made selfish choices, I lied, I betrayed you," she swallowed, her eyes glistening with tears. "And I've thought about it every day, every hour. I can't believe how much damage I've done, not just to us but to you." Brian felt the sting of her words, but he kept his face impassive. "Then why, Antonia? Why wasn't any of that enough to make you stop before things got this bad?" She looked down, the silence hanging heavily between them. "I was lost, I think. I wanted excitement, a sense of purpose outside our life, something that made me feel alive. And when Gerald came along, I was so blinded by that feeling that I ignored the consequences. I thought I could keep the two worlds separate, that somehow it wouldn't affect us. But I was wrong." Brian's jaw tightened. "Wrong doesn't even begin to cover it. You turned our life into a lie, Antonia. And it wasn't just your affair, it was the secrecy, the deception. You kept me in the dark, even when the police came knocking. And now you want me to forgive you?" She nodded, her voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Brian. But I wanted you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. I never meant to destroy our life. I was selfish, but I never wanted to hurt you like this. I thought I could control it." A bitter smile tugged at Brian's lips. "Control? That's what you thought? You lost control the moment you started down that path. And now we're both paying for it." Antonia reached out, her hand hovering in the air before she pulled it back. "I know. I've lost everything, my family, my freedom, and you. I don't expect anything from you, but I just wanted you to know that, even now, even after everything. I wish I could take it all back." Brian sighed, feeling a mixture of anger, sadness, and, unexpectedly, a faint glimmer of compassion. "Well, you can't, Antonia. What's done is done. But I can't carry this anger forever. I have to let it go, for my own sake. I need to move on, and I need to do it without looking back." Antonia nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand. Thank you, for at least listening. I know it doesn't change anything, but it means a lot to me." Brian gave a curt nod, standing up. "Goodbye, Antonia. I hope, for your sake, you learned something from all of this." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left the room, feeling the weight of her apology lift from his shoulders. He knew that while forgiveness might come someday, he didn't need it now to move forward. He walked out of the courthouse, ready to begin his new life, leaving the past and its painful memories firmly behind him. Months had passed since Brian last saw Antonia, and in that time, he'd felt the slow, steady return of normalcy in his life. His days were no longer clouded by scandal or suspicion, and the media attention had faded. The town had moved on, and so had he. Brian poured himself into work, reconnected with friends, and focused on rebuilding a life that felt stable and genuinely his own. One evening, while sorting through his mail, Brian found a letter with no return address. Opening it, he discovered it was from Lee, an old friend of his and Antonia's who had known them both for years. They hadn't been particularly close since the scandal, but Brian assumed Lee had just wanted to reach out and reconnect after all the dust had settled. The letter was brief, and as he read it, Brian felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Brian, I never intended for you to find out this way, but I owe you the truth. Gerald O'Brien wasn't just Antonia's mistake, he was mine, too. I had a financial interest tied up in his business, and when he threatened to expose certain dealings, things got out of control. I'm not proud of what happened, but I thought you should know that Antonia's involvement wasn't as simple as it seemed. She was in over her head, and, in a way, so was I." Brian sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched in his hands. Lee's vague confession hinted at a deeper conspiracy, one that complicated his understanding of everything he believed about Antonia's betrayal. If Lee had been entangled with O'Brien's business and had a motive tied to O'Brien's murder, then Antonia's involvement might have been more than just a reckless affair, it might have been an escape from a situation she couldn't control. Suddenly, memories flashed through Brian's mind: Antonia's evasive behavior, her growing fear before the police arrived, her tearful confession that she hadn't meant to get involved. Had she been dragged into something she couldn't escape? Was her desperation to feel alive a cover for the fear she'd carried, knowing she was mixed up in dangerous dealings with men like Lee? Despite the betrayal, Brian felt a pang of sadness, a sliver of doubt creeping in. The finality he had found in moving on now felt murky, the clean-cut edges of his closure softened by this new, haunting realization. He placed the letter down, letting out a long breath. Whatever Lee's role had been, it didn't change what he'd gone through. He had suffered enough, endured humiliation and heartbreak, and, regardless of these revelations, Antonia's choices had still shattered their life together. With a renewed determination, Brian stood up, knowing he would keep moving forward. His life was no longer tied to the tangled web Antonia had woven. He was free from her lies, from the haunting shadows of her affair, and from any remaining doubts. As he left the room, he left the letter behind, a relic of a past he'd survived. Brian knew he would find peace, and this time, it would be a peace he had earned on his own terms, with a future untouched by the chaos he'd finally put to rest.